I never thought silence could feel so loud. Some mornings I wake up and the quiet in my house presses down on me like a heavy blanket. There's no alarm blaring from the kitchen, no hurried footsteps on the stairs, no clatter of the office or the buzz of a phone demanding attention, just quiet. And it's deafening. I remember my first day of retirement clearly. It should have felt like freedom. I had imagined lying in bed a little longer, sipping coffee slowly while watching the sunrise. I thought I would finally have time for the things I had put off for decades. And for a brief moment, it did feel like that. A gentle morning, sunlight spilling across the wooden floor, a book resting unopened in my lap. But by the third week, that gentle quiet had started to turn into something heavier, something I wasn't prepared for. You see, for over 40 years, my identity had been tied to my work. I was the guy who fixed problems, who led meetings, who always knew what needed to be done before anyone else did. I had a title, a desk, a schedule that shaped my days, and somehow shaped me. I thought retirement would be a reward, a long-awaited break. I never imagined it would feel like losing myself. The first few months, I told myself I was just adjusting. I filled my days with errands, small projects around the house, even volunteering here and there. But every evening, when the world outside started winding down and my home grew still, I felt it. The deep, unsettling emptiness of no longer being needed. My calendar was suddenly full of blank pages. My phone only rang when bills needed to be paid, and even my own reflection in the mirror seemed to look at me like a stranger. I began to notice things I had never paid attention to before. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside my window, the tick of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Every little noise became amplified in the silence, a reminder that I was alone with my thoughts. And some of those thoughts, well, they weren't pleasant. Loneliness has a quiet way of creeping in. It doesn't announce itself. One day I realized I hadn't spoken more than a few sentences to another adult in 2 days. I hadn't driven anywhere, hadn't met anyone who wasn't family. My wife passed a few years ago, and my children live hours away, busy with their own lives. I had imagined that retirement would bring visits, laughter, maybe new hobbies. Instead, I found myself sitting by the window, staring at the empty street, wondering if I had done enough in my life, if I had mattered at all. And yet, there was something strangely intimate about those quiet mornings. They forced me to confront myself in ways I hadn't before, to face fears I had ignored while I was busy with work and responsibilities, to ask questions I didn't have the courage to ask when my life was full of meetings and deadlines. Who am I if I'm not needed? What does it mean to live a life of purpose when no one is waiting for you to show up? Sometimes I catch myself talking to the house. I know it sounds silly, but it's a habit I've developed. "Good morning, old friend," I'll whisper to the walls, or "I'll be back soon" when I step out for a walk. It's my way of breaking the silence, of reminding myself that I exist, that I'm still here, even if the world doesn't seem to notice. And perhaps the hardest part isn't the silence itself. It's the realization that retirement isn't just about having time. It's about losing the rhythm of life you had grown used to. It's about learning to live without the structure that once gave your days meaning. And more than anything, it's about confronting the quiet truth that growing old is not only about aging, it's about understanding your place in a world that keeps moving forward, even when you stop. So this is my story. The story of a man who thought retirement would be simple, peaceful, and freeing. The story of the hardest year of my life. The year I learned that freedom comes with a price. The cost of loneliness, of lost identity, and of dreams deferred. If you are sitting there, perhaps retired or nearing it, and you think that life will suddenly be easier, I hope my story will offer a gentle warning, because nobody told me what it would really feel like to retire. Nobody warned me that the silence would speak louder than words. And yet, in this silence, in this emptiness, I am beginning to discover something I had forgotten along the way. Something that perhaps can be found in the quiet moments, if we are brave enough to look for it. But that journey
finding meaning after retirement, is a story for another part of my life.
Before retirement, my life had a rhythm, steady, predictable, and for a long time comforting. I would wake up at the same time every day, shower, shave, dress in a suit that had grown soft from years of wear, and step out into the world with a sense of purpose. The mornings smelled of strong coffee and newspaper ink. My shoes clicked against the polished floors of my office building, a sound that, to me, meant responsibility, reliability, and respect. Work defined me. I was a manager at a mid-sized company, and my days were filled with meetings, reports, deadlines, and decisions. I thrived in the chaos, in the organized hustle of it all. People counted on me to solve problems, to guide teams, to make things happen. And in those moments, I felt alive, important, needed. Looking back, I can see now that I tied my self-worth to my productivity. I measured my value in emails sent, deals closed, and projects completed. Even my social life revolved around work. Weekend golf outings with colleagues, lunches with clients, networking events that felt more like rituals than enjoyment. And yet, I was happy, or at least I thought I was. There were sacrifices, of course. Late nights at the office meant missing birthdays, skipping family dinners, and ignoring the quiet plea for attention from my children. My wife would leave gentle notes on my desk, reminders of family dinners I had promised I'd attend but often didn't. I was so absorbed in my work that I convinced myself these were small prices to pay for the life I wanted to build, the stability I wanted to provide. I had routines that gave my life structure. Monday mornings were for planning the week, Tuesdays were for client visits, Wednesday afternoons were filled with reports. By Friday, I was exhausted but satisfied, knowing I had done what was expected of me. Even the commute, which seemed tedious at the time, had a rhythm that grounded me. The hum of the engine, the familiar faces at the bus stop, the aroma of the coffee shop near the office, they all marked the passage of time, gave shape to my days. And then there were the small joys. An approving glance from my boss, a handshake from a grateful client, the feeling of closing a difficult deal. Those moments felt like victories, proof that my life had meaning. I was part of a machine, a system, a world that moved at a pace I could understand and contribute to. But even in the midst of all that, there were cracks. Moments when I would sit in my office late at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there was. The successes, the routines, the busy days, they were comforting, yes, but they weren't fulfilling. I had dreams I had shelved, hobbies I had neglected, conversations I had postponed. But there was always tomorrow, always the next meeting, the next deadline, the next chance to prove myself. I realize now that those days of work, structured and predictable as they were, had shielded me from facing the bigger questions of life. Who was I beyond my job? What would I do when the office door closed for the last time? How would I measure myself if there were no reports, no meetings, no responsibilities that demanded my attention? Even so, I loved the rhythm of it. The daily hustle, the interactions, the sense that I mattered in the grand machinery of life. Work gave me identity, gave me confidence, and yes, gave me purpose. And I didn't realize, not fully, that all of that, every project, every meeting, every handshake, was also preparing me for a silence I would one day face. I remember the last week before retirement like a strange mix of celebration and disbelief. Colleagues threw a small gathering in the break room. Cards were signed, stories were shared, laughter echoed through the office halls. Everyone seemed happy for me, but I could feel a subtle tension beneath it all. I think we all knew, even then, that my departure marked the end of an era, not just for the company, but for me. As I drove home that evening, I stared out the window at the streets, the familiar shops, the people hurrying along with their lives. It felt unreal to think that after Monday, none of this would be my world anymore. No more meetings, no more deadlines, no more responsibilities that made me feel indispensable. I thought I was ready. I told myself I was ready. But deep down, a quiet unease had already begun to settle in my chest. I didn't know it then, but the life I had built my identity around, the life that had shaped me for decades, was about to vanish, and with it, a part of me that I had taken for granted. I suppose, in some ways, I had been preparing for this moment all along without realizing it. The years of structure, of work, of routine, they had kept the questions at bay. But once the structure disappeared, the questions didn't. And when retirement finally arrived, I was left facing them alone, without the familiar rhythm of work to shield me from the quiet, uncomfortable truth that I was no longer needed in the way I had always been.
When I first imagined retirement, I pictured it as a golden period, a time of freedom, peace, and leisure. I thought of mornings that stretched luxuriously into afternoons spent reading on the porch or taking long walks, and evenings with family or friends, laughter echoing through the house. I envisioned a life unburdened by deadlines, a life where I could finally enjoy the fruits of decades of labor. I had seen it in movies, read about it in magazines, and listened to friends describe it with a kind of dreamy nostalgia. Retirement, I thought, would be the reward for a lifetime of hard work. I pictured myself traveling, rediscovering hobbies, and finally indulging in the little pleasures I had neglected. I imagined myself waking up with purpose every day, guided by desire rather than obligation. And for a while, the beginning felt just like that. The first few days were full of gentle optimism. I bought a new set of tools for small home projects I had long postponed. I started keeping a journal, noting every moment of freedom I could find. I tried to fill my calendar with activities that would make me feel alive. I even called a few old friends, hoping to rekindle connections I had let fade during my working years. But very quickly, reality began to diverge from the picture I had painted in my mind. The mornings I had imagined as peaceful were often heavy with an unexpected emptiness. Coffee didn't taste as rich when no one was around to share it with. Walks felt longer, and the streets quieter than I remembered. Calls to friends were polite but fleeting, and family visits were rare, leaving me staring at the walls of my home with a sense of isolation I hadn't anticipated. I had assumed that the skills I had spent decades honing, decision-making, problem-solving, leadership, would still have a place in this new chapter of life. But I quickly realized that retirement doesn't need a manager. Retirement doesn't care if you can negotiate a deal or organize a team. The world moves on, but it no longer waits for your input. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. I also assumed that time alone would be liberating. But there's a difference between choosing solitude and being left alone. In work, solitude was a choice. I could step into my office, focus, and then emerge to a world that needed me. In retirement, the solitude was imposed. It wasn't peaceful. It was silent. And silence has a way of amplifying thoughts you'd rather ignore. There were small things, too, that I hadn't anticipated. The empty driveway in the morning, the quiet kitchen, the lack of emails, meetings, and tasks. Even the daily newspaper felt different, pages filled with news that didn't concern me, stories about people whose lives had nothing to do with mine. I began to realize that retirement isn't just a change of schedule, it's a change of context. The world continues on its busy, noisy path, and you are quietly left on the sidelines. I remember a particular afternoon when the weight of these expectations versus reality hit me fully. I had set out a plan for the day, a small repair in the garage, a phone call to an old friend, a walk in the park. But by noon, none of it felt satisfying. The repair project didn't fill me with accomplishment. It reminded me of all the tasks I used to delegate or finish in a day. The phone call felt obligatory, not joyful. And the walk, well, the walk was beautiful, but there was no one to share the moment with. By the time I returned home, the house felt colder, quieter, emptier than ever. I had imagined retirement as a time to rediscover joy. Instead, I found myself grappling with the subtle realization that joy doesn't come from simply having time. It comes from connection, from purpose, from being needed. And for the first time, I had to confront the possibility that those things were no longer guaranteed. The gap between expectation and reality widened with every passing week. I began to notice the little things that work had provided, but retirement could not. A sense of urgency that gave meaning to the day, the camaraderie of colleagues who shared your struggles and victories, the feeling that your actions had an impact beyond yourself. Retirement offered none of that, at least not automatically. It was like being given a blank canvas without instructions or paint. You had freedom, yes, but also an unfamiliar, sometimes frightening responsibility to find meaning on your own. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt lost. I had planned for financial stability, for comfort, for the basic logistics of life after work, but I hadn't planned for emotional stability. I hadn't considered the quiet ache of being unneeded, the subtle erosion of identity that came with the disappearance of structure. I hadn't anticipated that one day I would look at myself in the mirror and wonder, who am I now, if not the man I was at work? And so, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first cracks appeared. The expectations I had clung to, the vision of retirement as blissful freedom, began to falter under the weight of reality. What I had imagined as peaceful and fulfilling started to feel lonely. And that loneliness, though gentle at first, would grow steadily, quietly, into the most challenging part of my life.
It didn't happen all at once. The emptiness came slowly, in small, almost imperceptible ways. At first, I barely noticed it. A quiet moment here, a lingering sigh there. But over weeks, those tiny moments began to accumulate until they formed a weight I couldn't ignore. Mornings, which I had imagined would be my favorite part of the day, became the hardest. The alarm still went off, not out of necessity, but out of habit, and I would rise to an empty house. The coffee brewed itself, the toast browned itself, but there was no one to sit across from me, no one to break the silence with a casual remark or shared laughter. Sometimes I would carry my cup to the window and watch the world outside, hoping for the noise, the movement, the sense of life that had always surrounded me. But the street was quiet, and I was alone. I began to notice the little things that used to be background noise, now screaming their absence. The voicemail light on my phone blinking with nothing but automated messages, the distant hum of traffic outside, the absence of footsteps in the hall. Even my own movements seemed louder, clattering dishes in the kitchen, the creak of the floorboards, the shuffle of my slippers. The house, which had once been comforting, felt hollow. Calls from family became infrequent, filled with polite updates rather than real connection. My children had lives of their own, busy and full, and I understood that. But understanding did little to quiet the ache that came from being out of the loop, from realizing that the small daily roles I had once played in their lives, counselor, helper, presence, were fading. At first, I tried to fill the gaps with small routines. I would sweep the floor, tend to the garden, water the plants. I even tried reading books I had always meant to, but found my mind wandering, unable to focus. The tasks were comforting in their familiarity, but they didn't fill the silence, didn't push back the emptiness that had begun to settle in my chest. Weekends, which I had once looked forward to as opportunities for leisure and connection, now stretched endlessly. Saturday and Sunday blurred into each other, distinguished only by the sun's journey across the sky. I would take walks through the neighborhood, passing familiar houses and people I once knew casually. Smiles and nods were exchanged, but they were surface-level gestures, brief and polite, never enough to reach the part of me that longed for real connection. Evenings were the hardest. I would make dinner, sometimes just for myself, sometimes skipping it entirely because the act of eating alone felt too heavy. I would sit in my favorite chair, staring at the television, but the shows felt distant, disconnected. Laughter from canned audiences reminded me of the absence of real laughter in my own home. And when the night deepened, when the streetlights cast long shadows across the empty rooms, the quiet became oppressive. I began to catch myself reminiscing more than I had before. Memories of work, of colleagues, of days when I mattered in ways that were tangible and immediate would surface unbidden. I remembered the pride in completing a project, the joy of helping a client, the camaraderie of lunch breaks with friends. And I realized that what I missed most wasn't the work itself, but the feeling of being needed, of belonging, of purpose. There were also small, almost absurd moments that brought the emptiness into sharp relief. I would find myself setting the table for an imagined guest, or brewing an extra cup of coffee out of habit, only to remember that I was alone. I would rehearse phone conversations that would never happen, imagining voices that would not call. The mind has a strange way of filling gaps when the heart aches for connection. Even in the presence of others, the emptiness persisted. Family visits, though rare, were fleeting. Conversations were polite, sometimes distracted. I would return to my home afterward, greeted once more by silence, and the heaviness of it would settle back in like a shadow I couldn't shake. I started to realize that retirement wasn't just about having free time, it was about losing the structure and roles that had defined me. And with that loss came an unexpected companion, loneliness. Not the dramatic, heartbreaking kind you read about in novels, but the quiet, insidious kind that creeps in at the edges of your day, a subtle ache that never quite disappears. It was in those first signs of emptiness that I began to understand something important, that the hardest part of retirement isn't the lack of money or the absence of tasks, it's the absence of purpose. And when purpose disappears, so does a part of yourself, leaving a hollow space where identity once lived. I tried to fight it at first, filling my days with activity, trying to recreate the sense of importance I once had. But the emptiness was patient, and it waited for me to notice it. Until one day, it wasn't just a background ache, it was the center of my world.
I remember the exact moment it hit me, this quiet, heavy truth that had been creeping in for months, but which I had somehow avoided seeing fully. I was sitting in my chair, the same one I had occupied for decades during late-night work sessions, staring out at the empty street. The wind stirred the bare branches of the trees, and I could hear the faint hum of a distant car, but otherwise, nothing. The silence was absolute. I had spent the morning tinkering in the garage, trying to distract myself with a small repair project. By noon, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I sat down with a cup of coffee, and for the first time, it really sank in. Nobody needed me. Not like they used to. My office no longer existed. My colleagues no longer sought my advice. My children could manage perfectly fine without my guidance. Even my friends had their own lives, their own routines, and their own challenges. I was optional. It wasn't a moment of despair exactly. It was more subtle, more profound. A quiet, sinking awareness that the roles that had defined me, roles I had worked my entire life to excel in, were gone. And without them, who was I? For decades, my work had been my identity. I was the one people turned to when there was a problem, the one who made decisions, the one who got things done. I was respected, relied upon, and needed. I carried that responsibility proudly. It shaped my self-esteem, my daily rhythm, even my relationships. But now, all of it had vanished, and in its place, there was silence. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that this was natural, that everyone went through it. "This is retirement," I whispered to the walls. "It's supposed to be quiet, reflective, peaceful." But the words felt hollow. The realization gnawed at me like a persistent, invisible weight. For the first time in years, I felt irrelevant. Not because anyone had told me so, but because the absence of need spoke louder than any words could. The emptiness wasn't just about being alone, it was about not mattering. It was a profound disorientation, like stepping off a cliff and realizing the air beneath your feet had vanished. All the years of work, all the achievements, all the late nights and sacrifices, they had prepared me for life in a structured world, but not for a world where structure no longer recognized you. I began to reflect on the countless ways I had measured myself by others' needs. The promotions, the project completions, the accolades, they all confirmed that I had a place, that I mattered. But in retirement, the metrics disappeared. There were no projects to complete, no accolades to earn, no urgent problems to solve. And suddenly, I was left facing the raw, unfiltered question, who am I if no one needs me? It wasn't an easy question, and the answer didn't come quickly. I spent long days staring at the ceiling, replaying memories, weighing choices, wondering if I had missed the moments that truly mattered. I thought about the work I had done, the people I had helped, the responsibilities I had carried, and yet none of it filled the void of the present. Past achievements, while meaningful, offered no immediate purpose. There were moments when I felt almost guilty for feeling this way. I had provided for my family, built a career, contributed to my community. By every measurable standard, I had succeeded. But success, it turns out, doesn't always protect you from the quiet ache of irrelevance. The human mind, when stripped of daily roles and responsibilities, tends to focus on what's missing rather than what has been accomplished. I remember sitting there, coffee cooling in my hands, and feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and curiosity. Sorrow for the life I had known and the sense of purpose I had lost. Curiosity because, in that moment, I realized that I was staring directly at the core of what it means to retire. Not just stepping away from work, but stepping into a new, uncharted territory, where identity must be rebuilt piece by piece. It was a painful recognition, yes, but it was also the first step toward understanding. I couldn't go back and change the past. I couldn't restore the roles I had held for so long. But I could acknowledge the truth of the present. And in doing so, I began to glimpse the possibility of shaping a new kind of purpose, one that wasn't dictated by a job, a title, or the expectations of others. That day, the deep realization wasn't a dramatic event. There was no sudden heartbreak, no tears falling unbidden. It was quiet, almost clinical in its clarity, yet it left a mark, an invisible line drawn across the landscape of my life. On one side was the man I had been, busy, needed, respected. On the other side was the man I had become, retired, optional, searching. And somewhere in between, I understood that the journey forward would require a courage I never needed before. The courage to confront loneliness, to redefine purpose, and to accept the subtle, unspoken losses that retirement brings.
Once the initial realization settled in, the days began to stretch endlessly. Time, which I had once measured in meetings, deadlines, and projects, now seemed to move at its own slow, unrelenting pace. Mornings were heavy, afternoons long, evenings even heavier. Every day felt like a quiet echo of the one before, punctuated only by the faint sounds of a house too still for comfort. I tried to establish routines. I would make breakfast, go for a walk, water the garden, read a book, or even tackle small household projects. On paper, it looked like a productive, satisfying day. But in reality, each task became a reminder of what I no longer had: urgency, importance, connection. Sweeping the floor wasn't fulfilling, it was merely an act to fill time. A walk, no matter how beautiful, ended with me returning to an empty house. Reading a book often led to drifting thoughts, wandering back to memories of work, of purpose, of a life that demanded me. The nights were the hardest. Darkness in the house seemed heavier than the darkness outside. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of an old house, the wind rattling the window panes. Thoughts that I could ignore during the day, distracted by minor tasks and routines, would surface relentlessly. Regrets about missed opportunities, small failures, the words left unsaid, the moments I had overlooked with my family, all of it came back in a quiet, pressing wave. Some nights I would wander the house aimlessly, checking drawers, straightening chairs, or simply pacing from room to room. The purpose was unclear, even to me, but it was a way to avoid sitting still, to avoid facing the emptiness head-on. I found myself talking aloud, sometimes to the walls, sometimes to the faint memory of my late wife. Did I do enough? I would whisper to the empty rooms. Was I a good father? A good husband? Did I matter? The walls, of course, did not answer, and that silence felt heavier than any words. Boredom became a constant companion. Not the casual boredom that comes from waiting for something fun to happen, but a deep existential boredom, the feeling that your days, as long as they are, no longer have a reason to exist. I would start one activity only to abandon it midway. Hobbies I had once imagined I'd enjoy, painting, woodworking, journaling, felt flat and unsatisfying. It was as though my hands knew what to do, but my heart refused to care. Even meals, which had once been a source of comfort and routine, became hollow. Cooking for one, eating in silence, the absence of conversation, it was all a reminder of what had been lost. I began skipping meals sometimes, not out of hunger, but out of a strange inertia, a lack of motivation that surprised me. There were moments when I tried to connect with the world outside. I would call friends, attend community events, or even strike up conversations at the grocery store. But those interactions often felt superficial. People had their own lives, and though they were polite, there was no sense of urgency in needing me around. And without that sense of being needed, I felt adrift. The emotional struggles weren't loud or dramatic. There were no outbursts, no tears in public. They were subtle, creeping into every corner of my day. A quiet dissatisfaction, a shadow behind every activity, a gentle ache that never fully went away. Some mornings I woke with a sense of dread, not about any particular task, but about the day itself, the prospect of hours to fill with little that mattered. Some nights sleep was elusive, my mind replaying memories, regrets, and unasked questions. I realized that part of the struggle wasn't just loneliness, it was identity. I no longer had the roles that had defined me for decades. I wasn't the manager, the problem solver, the reliable hand that people counted on. Those titles, those responsibilities had given me shape. Without them, I felt like a ship adrift in calm but endless waters, moving without direction, at the mercy of forces I could not control. Even when I tried to focus on gratitude, on the quiet beauty of the mornings, on the chance to slow down, on the freedom from obligations, I often found myself returning to the same question: what is my purpose now? And that question, unanswerable in the quiet of my home, gnawed at me day and night. It was during these daily struggles that I began to understand something profound. Retirement is not just a physical transition, it's an emotional one. The body may rest, the schedule may empty, but the mind and heart are left to grapple with the absence of structure, of recognition, of necessity. And without confronting that, the days become a slow erosion of self, a quiet unraveling that few are prepared to face. But even in the depth of these struggles, there were glimmers, moments where I recognized that this discomfort was part of a larger process. A process of understanding who I am beyond work, beyond recognition, beyond routine. A process that, though painful, was slowly teaching me that purpose isn't given, it must be rediscovered.
As the months of retirement stretched on, I found myself spending more time looking backward than forward. The days of struggle had begun to carve space for reflection, and with reflection came regrets, small ones, large ones, regrets both fleeting and permanent. I thought of my work and the years I had poured into it. I had loved it, of course. I had thrived on responsibility, achievement, and being needed. But I also realized how many moments I had sacrificed along the way. Birthdays missed, anniversaries attended in half-hearted fatigue, conversations with my children hurried or postponed because I had important work to finish. At the time, I had told myself these were small prices to pay for stability and success. Now, in the quiet of my home, those small sacrifices loomed large, each one a reminder of opportunities that had quietly slipped away. There were evenings I would replay arguments in my mind, words I had said in haste, promises I had broken, and moments of silence that should have been filled with love but weren't. I thought about the times I could have been kinder, more patient, more present. I thought of my children's laughter I missed, the subtle signs of my wife's fatigue I ignored, the friendships that dwindled because I was too busy chasing recognition. Regret, I discovered, isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always hit like a lightning bolt. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits patiently, only to surface in quiet moments when you are washing the dishes or sitting by the window or lying awake at 2 a.m., staring at a ceiling you have cleaned 100 times before. And that whisper can be relentless, pressing you to question your choices, your priorities, and the life you built. I also thought about the little things I had taken for granted, a simple phone call from a colleague, the camaraderie of a shared lunch, the brief sense of accomplishment at finishing a project. I realized how much of my identity had been wrapped up in these small interactions and the daily rhythm of work. And now that they were gone, I felt untethered, drifting in a quiet sea of memory. Yet reflection also brought clarity. I could see not just the missed moments, but the life I had built with care, the family I had loved in my own way, the accomplishments I had earned. There were triumphs I could still hold on to, lessons I had learned, and values I had tried to pass on. And although the regrets were real, they coexisted with gratitude for what I had been able to experience and contribute. I spent long afternoons leafing through old photographs, letters, and keepsakes. Each one was a story, a life lived, a connection once vibrant. I remembered my wedding day, my children's first steps, late-night talks with friends about dreams and fears. And while those memories were tinged with the ache of time past, they also reminded me that I had been present in important ways, even if imperfectly. In these reflections, I began to understand that regret doesn't exist in isolation. It is part of the human condition. It is both a teacher and a companion, urging you to acknowledge your choices while challenging you to find meaning despite them. I realized I could not rewrite the past, and I could not reclaim lost time, but I could learn from it, honor it, and let it shape the way I approached the present. I also began to see that regret and loneliness were intertwined. The moments I missed, the connections I neglected, the roles I had prioritized over relationships, they all contributed to the silence I now faced. Retirement, in its stark quiet, made those absences impossible to ignore. But recognizing them, naming them, and sitting with them was the first step toward healing. One afternoon, as I sipped tea by the window, I thought about the life I still had. I thought about the chance to connect differently, to nurture new routines, to find small ways of being useful again, even if the forms were unfamiliar. And slowly, I began to realize that reflection was not just about regret. It was about learning, about understanding, and about preparing for the next chapter. Regret, I learned, does not have to be paralyzing. It can be a gentle guide, pointing toward what matters most, nudging you to cherish relationships, to savor small moments, and to remain present. It can remind you that while some doors are closed, others can still be opened, doors to connection, to purpose, to meaning in a life that is quiet but not finished. By the time the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the floor, I felt a subtle shift. The weight of regret was still there, yes, but it was tempered by understanding. I could see the contours of my life with honesty, recognizing both successes and failures, joys and losses. And in that quiet honesty, I sensed the possibility of moving forward, not as the man I had been at work, but as a man still capable of meaning, still capable of being present, still capable of finding purpose in unexpected places.
After months of quiet reflection, I realized that I could not remain adrift. The loneliness and emptiness had become a constant companion, and I knew that to survive, not just physically but emotionally, I had to find something to anchor myself to. I had to search for purpose, even if it wasn't the kind of purpose I had known during my working years. At first, the search was awkward. I tried hobbies I had once imagined I would enjoy: woodworking, gardening, painting, even joining a local book club. Some of it brought fleeting satisfaction, but it often felt hollow, like trying to drink from a glass that had a crack in it. The act was there, but the meaning I craved, the sense of being needed, was missing. I began to look outward. Volunteering, I thought, might be a way to reconnect with the world. I signed up at a local community center, helping with small administrative tasks, tutoring young students, or just offering company to those who needed it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I felt a shift. For the first time in months, I sensed that my actions had impact, however small. A student smiled when I helped him understand a problem. A neighbor thanked me for listening. And I realized that usefulness doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in small, quiet moments of attention. I also sought connection with friends I had long neglected. Coffee dates, phone calls, walks together. These encounters reminded me that life did not stop just because my career had ended. People still valued presence, still cherished kindness, still appreciated company. And though these moments were brief, they began to fill the quiet spaces that had once felt unfillable. Exercise became another anchor. Long walks through the park, stretching routines, gentle swimming, all of it helped me reconnect with my body, with my senses, with the feeling of being alive. I began to notice small details again: the crunch of leaves underfoot, the scent of fresh air, the warmth of sunlight on my face. Physical activity, I realized, was not just for health, it was for grounding, for reminding myself that I still existed in the world and that my presence mattered. I also took time to write. Journals, letters, reflections, sometimes sent, sometimes kept private. Writing became a way to organize my thoughts, confront my fears, and articulate emotions I had long buried under decades of work. It allowed me to externalize the heaviness, to examine it, and sometimes even to laugh at the absurdities of my own struggles. Yet purpose was not always easy to find. There were days when all these attempts felt futile, when I would sit in the living room, staring at the walls, wondering if any of it truly mattered. But I learned to accept that searching is part of the journey. Purpose does not always arrive fully formed. Sometimes it comes in fragments, in moments, in small victories. It is a mosaic, not a single stroke of brilliance. One of the most surprising lessons I learned during this search was that purpose is often found in giving. Not giving to the world in grand gestures, but giving in ways that create small ripples of connection. A phone call to someone lonely, a smile to a stranger, a patient ear for a young person struggling. These small acts reminded me that usefulness is not always measured by achievement, by income, or by titles. It is measured by presence, by attention, by care. I also began to accept that purpose could coexist with silence. Not all days need to be filled with action or productivity. Some days are for reflection, for quiet appreciation, for simply being. I learned to sit on my porch in the early morning, coffee in hand, and watch the world wake up.
I learned to notice the rhythm of life outside my window, the birds, the wind, the distant sounds of children playing. In that quiet observation, I found a subtle but profound sense of belonging. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I felt a shift in myself. I was no longer entirely defined by work, by the roles that had dictated my identity for decades. I was discovering new dimensions of myself: patience, reflection, empathy, and the quiet joy of small acts of kindness. I realized that purpose does not always roar, it often whispers. It is not always recognized by the world, it is often recognized only by the heart. And in that recognition, I began to feel lighter. The emptiness, while still present at times, no longer dominated my days. I could see that meaning was not something I had lost, it was something I had yet to rediscover, something that could take many forms in this new chapter of life.
Acceptance did not come suddenly. It arrived quietly, in fragments, like the slow light of dawn breaking across a dark room. I had spent months wrestling with loneliness, regret, and the disorienting loss of purpose. But over time, I began to realize that resisting the realities of retirement only deepened my unease. The silence, the emptiness, the sense of being unneeded, they were part of life's natural rhythm at this stage. Accepting them didn't mean surrendering. It meant acknowledging the truth and finding a way to live with it. I started by accepting the quiet itself. Instead of fleeing the stillness of the house or distracting myself endlessly with small tasks, I learned to sit with it. I would pour a cup of coffee, settle by the window, and simply listen. The wind in the trees, the distant sounds of traffic, the faint chirping of birds, all of it became a gentle reminder that life continues, even in its quiet moments. In embracing silence rather than fearing it, I discovered a strange comfort. I also began to accept the physical realities of aging. My body, once so reliable, now reminded me of its limits: creaking joints, slower movements, unexpected fatigue. I had once resisted these changes, clinging to the memory of a younger, stronger self, but resistance only caused frustration. Acceptance, on the other hand, allowed me to adjust, to find joy in the abilities I still possessed, and to approach each day with patience rather than disappointment. Emotionally, acceptance meant coming to terms with the fact that I was no longer needed in the same ways I had been before. At first, this truth was almost unbearable. I had been the problem solver, the helper, the constant presence in so many lives. But life moves forward and roles shift. By acknowledging that I could not reclaim the past, I freed myself to explore new ways of being present, new ways of contributing, even if they were quieter and smaller than before. Part of this process involved forgiving myself, forgiving the man I once was for the mistakes I had made, for the moments of neglect, for the times I prioritized work over family or friendship. Holding on to regret too tightly only poisoned the present. Acceptance meant releasing that weight, not erasing it, but understanding that imperfection is part of every life. I began to embrace routines that were gentle yet grounding. Morning walks became meditative, moments of journaling became a way to process emotions, and small acts of kindness, a call to a friend, helping a neighbor, mentoring a student, offered a sense of ongoing purpose. These actions didn't erase the challenges of retirement, but they provided a framework within which I could feel useful and connected again. I also accepted that not every day would be fulfilling, and that was okay. Some mornings I would wake heavy with loneliness or restlessness. Some evenings the ache of quiet would return. Acceptance didn't mean pretending these feelings didn't exist. It meant acknowledging them without letting them define me, without letting them dictate the worth of my life. Slowly, I noticed subtle shifts in my inner life. I began to feel a quiet contentment in simple pleasures: the warmth of sunlight on my skin, the smell of coffee brewing, the laughter of a neighbor's child across the street. Moments that once seemed ordinary now held weight because I had learned to notice them, to savor them. Acceptance made the world richer,
not because it changed, but because I had changed my relationship to it. I also realized the importance of presence, being fully here, even if only in small ways. I didn't need grand accomplishments to feel valuable. A shared conversation, a listening ear, a gentle word of advice, these became my new markers of purpose. Life, I learned, can be quietly meaningful even when it is stripped of the noise, accolades, and urgency that once defined it. Acceptance, in the end, became an act of courage. It was the courage to face the quiet, to confront regret and loneliness without running, to acknowledge the passage of time, and to find dignity in simply being. It didn't make retirement easy, but it made it livable, rich in subtle joys and honest reflection. By embracing the reality of my life as it was, aging body, shifting roles, quieter days, I discovered a peace I hadn't anticipated. The silence no longer pressed down on me as heavily. It became a space in which I could reflect, create, and connect in new ways. I could see that even in this slower, quieter chapter, there is life to be lived, lessons to be learned, and meaning to be found.
If there's one thing I've learned through these quiet years of retirement, it's that life does not end when work does. The transition is profound, yes, and it comes with challenges that many of us never anticipate: loneliness, loss of identity, and the weight of unstructured time. But it is also a chapter filled with lessons, if we are willing to notice them. To those who are younger, perhaps just starting their careers or thinking about the future, cherish your time, yes, but also cherish the moments with the people around you. Don't let work define your worth entirely. The love you give, the kindness you show, the attention you pay to family and friends, these create a legacy far deeper than any professional achievement. Life moves fast, and before you know it, the structure that gives you purpose may vanish, leaving only memories. Make sure those memories are worth holding. To those who, like me, are in retirement or nearing it, understand that purpose doesn't disappear, it simply transforms. The skills, wisdom, and experience you've accumulated over decades are not lost. They can be redirected in ways that are quieter, slower, but deeply meaningful. Volunteer, mentor, connect, write, create. Find the small ripples of impact that remind you that you still matter. Your presence, your attention, your care, they are more powerful than you think. Accept that some days will be heavy, some nights will feel longer than others. That is natural. Don't resist the silence, but don't let it consume you either. Sit with it, listen to it, and use it as a mirror to reflect on your life, your values, and the people who matter. Learn to appreciate the quiet moments, for in them you will find a subtle richness that the noise of work often obscures. And remember, aging is not a failure, it is a gift. It carries with it perspective, patience, and the ability to see life with a clarity that youth often misses. We may lose roles, responsibilities, and recognition, but we gain wisdom, resilience, and the freedom to shape our days in ways we could not before. If I could offer one gentle piece of advice, invest in relationships, invest in curiosity, and invest in yourself. These are the foundations that endure when everything else shifts. Purpose is not something handed to you. It is something discovered, nurtured, and sometimes quietly earned, one small action at a time. Retirement is not an end, it is a beginning, if you are brave enough to face it honestly, to accept it fully, and to explore the new ways your life can matter. Now, as I sit here in the quiet of my home, I feel a calm I didn't have in those early months of retirement. The silence no longer presses on me like a weight. Instead, it has become a space where I can breathe, reflect, and simply exist. I have learned that life does not need to be filled with urgency to have meaning. Even in stillness, even in moments of solitude, there is life to be lived and beauty to be found. I look back on the years with a mixture of gratitude and gentle sorrow. Gratitude for the life I've had, the love I've known, the lessons I've learned. Sorrow for the moments I missed, the words I left unsaid, the opportunities I let slip by. But sorrow is no longer heavy. It is a quiet companion that reminds me to be present, to value what remains, and to approach each day with intention and care. I have found peace in small things, the soft morning light spilling across the floor, the distant laughter of children playing outside, the warmth of a cup of tea in my hands. These moments remind me that life is not only measured in achievements or recognition, but in attention, presence, and the quiet joys that too often go unnoticed. And so I have learned to embrace the rhythm of my days, slow though they may be. I have learned to accept that I am no longer defined solely by my past roles or accomplishments. I am defined by the kindness I can offer, the connections I can nurture, and the life I continue to live, one quiet, intentional moment at a time. Retirement has taught me that life's meaning is not always loud. Sometimes it is whispered. Sometimes it is hidden in the small gestures, the fleeting interactions, the moments when we choose to be present. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that peace does not come from being needed by the world. It comes from accepting ourselves, our past, and the life we have now, exactly as it is. As I sit here sharing these thoughts with you, I wonder, have you ever felt the quiet weight of life slowing down? Have you ever noticed the spaces where purpose once lived, only to realize it must be rediscovered? If so, know that you are not alone. We all face these moments, whether in retirement or in the pauses between life's busy chapters. I'd like to ask you something. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. What brings you quiet joy? What small ways can you show care, offer presence, or rediscover meaning in your everyday moments? Sometimes the answers are simple. A phone call, a smile, a walk, a conversation. Sometimes they are profound, but every small step matters. If my story has resonated with you, perhaps it can remind you that no chapter is truly finished. Even in silence, even in solitude, there is space to grow, to care, and to live fully. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, gentle reflections, quiet journeys, and the shared experiences of life, consider joining this small community. Click subscribe, and let's continue exploring the human experience together, one story at a time. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for taking a moment to reflect alongside me. Life is quiet, life is fragile, but it is still beautiful.